In this video, I'm going to give you 9 tips on how to get the most of the masking feature in the new Adobe Lightroom. Hello amigos, this is Pablo Garcia, the engineer photographer. Adobe Lightroom changes to masking had been very well received. And in this video, I want to give you a number of tips to maximize your use of the changes. If you see this error message when trying to use the new Select Subject or Select Sky, you're going to have to close Lightroom and then start it again, and hopefully you won't have any more problems. But if the problem continues to happen, what you need to do is to update the driver for your graphics card. I have a Windows 10 computer, and that seemed to have done the trick, but I also heard that Apple computers are having similar problems. Close and open Lightroom and update your graphic drivers. This tip has to do about all photos. Photos that you took in the first half of 2017 or before, when we had earlier versions of Lightroom. Now I'm looking here at this image that is almost 10 years old, and you can see that I have a couple masks in which I had done some minor adjustments, for example to the eye and to the beak. But let's say I wanted to add a new mask to use the new Select Subject. It won't let me. I cannot do Select Subject, Select Sky, Color Range, Luminance, and Depth are all grayed out. The only ones are enabled are the brush, the linear gradient, and the radial gradient. And that has to do with the process version. Process is basically the brains behind Lightroom on how Lightroom manipulates the colors and the adjustment that it allows us to make. You may recall that in earlier versions of Lightroom, we have a brightness slider that later got replaced with exposure, and the texture and clarity sliders were not added until much later. So what you have to do if you have this situation when you cannot use the new tools is to update the process. To do that, go to the Develop module and come all the way to the bottom to Calibration. And you're going to see that this image, for example, is version 2. The most current one is version 5 that came with Lightroom 11 released a couple of weeks ago. If I update to version 5 just by clicking on it, it may change the colors on the image. Because of that, I recommend you make a virtual copy to keep your old edits. Now on this one, I'm going to go ahead and update to version 5. That was very easy, but you did see that the image did change quite a bit. Now I can create a new mask. I'm going to do Select Subject. It allows me to pick it. And now it's going to go ahead, process. It takes a few seconds and seems to be working. And it did a very nice job on selecting this bird. And now I can do my adjustments as desired. Another change that I really like that Lightroom has implemented is our ability to add names to the different masks. You know, recall that in earlier versions, every time we did a local adjustment, we just got a pin. We could hover over it to show us the areas that we had affected. But if we wanted to see what we're done, we had to go look at the sliders and try to remember what we did with that area. Now, it's very easy to add names. For example, I'm going to add a new mask with the brush. I'm going to paint here on top. And I'm just going to darken it a little bit. And now I'm going to double click the name of the mask group. Opens this box, and now I can say darken top of photo. And that's going to be the name of the mask. So the next time I come to this image, it's very easy to see what I did with that effect. Now this takes a little bit of time, you know, to add names to the different masks, either at the mask group or the different elements under it, the brushes or radio filters that you use. But by investing a little bit of time up front, it can really save you a lot of headache later on. Prior versions of Lightroom allow us to change the color of the mask overlay, but the choices were very limited. The choices were red, green, a lighter tone and a darker tone. And while the red and the green gave us some flexibility, sometimes wasn't enough. So if I turn the mask overlay on this flower, it's red, and actually it shows okay, but I can actually change it to any color. All I had to do is come into this little box where the color red is, click on it, and now I can pick any of the colors at the bottom or any of the colors in the color picker. And I can also change the opacity. And by selecting a color and opacity, I can pick a mask overlay color that really works for the image that I'm trying to edit. I have this photo here. I already did select subject. I'm going to turn on the mask. And it actually did a very nice job, right? It selected this area very precisely. But I have two problems with this image. One, it left out this step at the bottom. And two, it selected these two lamps. So what I want to be able to do is to add this area right here and subtract the two lamps. That's very easy to do. Let's do the add first. So I come here to the mask window. I click add. I can select any of the choices that I have. I'm going to select the brush in this case. I'm going to make it a little smaller. And I just paint over it. And now I'm done. Now I'm going to subtract. Click on subtract with the brush. And now I'm going to subtract, and I can be careful. You can be more precise than me. And now I can make refinements to my image. I can lower the exposure, for example, increase the contrast, clarity, and the light. Just remember to do basic math with that and subtract. Here we have this other image in which I already selected the subject. Let's see what it selects. So I did a very nice job of selecting the bridge and selecting this building. Now I'm going to zoom in. But as you can see, it also selected part of the background between elements of the bridge. I need to delete or erase or subtract all these areas in between, right? And I can do that very easily, as we mentioned earlier. Go to the subtract with the brush and subtract. Now, we also learned earlier that I can change the color of the mask overlay, but sometimes that's not sufficient. Another capability that is available is we can go here under the three little dots, click on it, and you have a number of ways to visualize your mask. Color overlay is the default, is what we already have here. But I can have the color overlay on a black and white image, or have the image on black and white, or on black. You can continue clicking the different choices, or you can do Alt-O and just cycle through the different ways to visualize the mask and find the one that works better for you in order to do the refinement that you want. For some time, we had color range masks in Lightroom, but in order to use them, we needed to apply a local adjustment first and then refine that adjustment with the color range. With the latest changes, now color range has been promoted at the same level as the brush, the linear gradient, and the trail gradient, and all the other choices. Let me give you an example. I have here this flower with a yellow center and the rest of the flower is white. I selected mask. I'm going to come to color range, and I get the picker, and I can click on any of the colors. There is yellow. It did a very nice job. I can also have the option of doing click and drag, and that selects a wider range of colors. And by hitting the shift key, I can add to the colors I already selected, whether that was a single point or an area, and I can do that up to 5 times. So if I do one more, I'm going to get this box that says I already did the 5 samples. By using the 5 samples, whether they're single colors or the little area with the click and drag, now I did a very good job of selecting the center of the flower. Now I can increase my exposure, for example, add contrast, add texture and clarity, some saturation, and there we have it. Just like the color mask, the luminosity mask has also been promoted. We can use it at the same level as any of the other tools. For this image, I already darkened the sky and also made some adjustments to the foreground, adjusting clarity, texture, and so on. Now, how can we use the luminosity mask? You can use it by itself or as part of refining some of the other masks with adding and subtracting. Let's use it by itself. I'm going to do add a new mask, luminosity range. If you look now, we have from dark to white. I'm going to do dash and burn. So let's start with burn. We're going to darken the shadows. So I'm going to bring the highlights down, and you can see how the image is changing. This little box represents the areas that are going to be affected, and you can see the dark in our image. I can move the triangle to the right, and that's basically smoothing the transition on the shadows. I'm going to make it a little smaller. And now I'm going to reduce the exposure by something like about 1/3 of a stop. And now I did basically a very fast burn as part of dash and burn. Now I'm going to add another mask. I'm also going to do luminosity range. This time I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to bring the shadows up. I'm going to bring the whites down a bit. I'm only looking at an area of highlights, and I'm going to smooth it out. And in this case, I'm going to increase exposure, something about 1/3. Now, it is also affecting the sky, right? They did a good job on this library, on the boat and some of the other highlight areas, but I don't want to affect the sky. So I can subtract the sky. I come to subtract, select sky. It's going to take a few seconds to process, and now I have it. So now I can refine how much additional exposure I did to my highlights, and whether you want to do any additional updates to that. Maybe I warm it up a bit. And there you have it. By using the Luminance Range, it's very easy now to do dash and burn globally to our image. Now in this image, I already used select subject to select the flower, and it did a very nice job. And then with that selection, I made some changes to the photo. I reduced the highlights, increased texture and clarity, and so on. Now what I want to do is, for the balance of the image, I want to maybe reduce brightness and saturation. But I don't have a select background. So what I can do is start with select subject and take the inverse of that selection to do the rest. And I have two ways of doing it. First, I'm going to go here to my mask that I had created for the flower. If I go to the three dots, it allows me to duplicate. I'm going to duplicate that mask. In that group, now I go to the subject, which was the flower, and I'm going to click on the three dots, and I'm going to invert it. And now I have selected the background. I'm going to come here to my sliders. I'm going to double click in effect to reset all of them. And now I'm going to darken. I'm going to reduce clarity. I'm going to reduce texture. I'm going to reduce saturation. And there you have it. Now I can turn off that mask. You can see how it was brighter before. And now with the effect that we just did, and it allows the flower to stand more. I'm going to turn off this mask because there's another way of doing it. And the other way, basically starting from scratch. I'm going to create a new mask, select the subject. I know I already did a very good job of selecting the subject. I'll just let it compute again. And now I'll basically do the same steps. I invert and do the adjustments that I did before. There we have. So you can either invert an existing mask that you already had, or you can start fresh, create a new mask, select a new subject or sky or whatever, and then invert that one. Talking about inverting masks, we had to be careful because at times it's not going to work for us. Let's try this. So I have this mask. I use select subject, and it did a very good job of selecting the flower, but it didn't select the stem, right? To do the stem, I had to add. If I click on add, I'm gonna add with the brush, and I'm gonna add the stem, and I'm gonna refine it a bit, and let's say we're there, okay? Now, I can make the adjustments that I want to do, like adding texture, adding clarity, maybe reduce the highlights, and make that flower really pop. I'm gonna increase saturation. Now I want to work on the background. I want to make the background darker. I want to reduce the saturation of the background. Unfortunately, if I go here to the mask that I created that includes both the initial select subject and the brush in which we added the stem, there is no invert at this level. Now, I'm going to try what I showed you just before, and I'm going to duplicate the mask. And now you may say, well, I have the two elements of that mask, the brush and the subject. I'm going to invert the subject. I'm going to invert the brush. I'm going to show what the mask is, and now it's selecting everything. And that's not what we wanted, right? We wanted just the background. Why this thing didn't work? Let's try to see it pictorially here. Here we have the photo and the area that we selected, which was the flower. To that, we want to add the area that we selected with the brush, which was the stem. When we add these two masks together, any of the areas that had been selected, whether in the select subject or with the brush, now are part of the combined mask. That's what we did. But then, when we inverted that original select subject, we ended up selecting everything that is in red, and the flower wasn't selected. Then we did the same invert with the area we did with the brush, and we ended up here. But the operation of adding both of them did not change. So when I add this to this, anything that is in red is going to result red on being selected, which is this one right here, which is basically not what we want. So basically, to invert these, we wanted to go to the mask group, click on invert, and have these what gets inverted. But Lightroom today with version 11 doesn't work that way. So let's go back to the flower. So we have the flower. I'm gonna remove that second mask that we created. So we're down to the original with just the subject. Now to select the background, now I have to take it in steps. And this is something you have to do every time you have one of these compound masks. You cannot just invert it. So I'm gonna start with a new mask. I'm gonna select the subject. And at this time, I'm not gonna add the stem. You need to work right at the beginning on your very first selection. In this case was select subject. So I'm going to take select subject. I'm going to invert it. Now the select subject is inverted. Now I need to subtract the stem. So I'm going to subtract with the brush, and so now the area that I have selected is everything around the flower and the stem. So now I can reduce my exposure, reduce texture, really reduce the clarity to make it very soft, reduce the saturation, and as you can see, it worked very well. I can turn this off. That was before, and this is now. So we have to be careful every time we invert, especially if you're having a compound group where you have more than one element as part of that mask. It won't allow you to invert right away. So that's something you have to keep in mind. Well, amigos, I hope you like these 9 tips about the masking changes in Lightroom. I'm going to leave you with this other video I did on how well or not select subject works. Please take a look at it. And as always, please subscribe, send me a comment, give me a like, help me grow the channel, and I'll see you next time.